Welcome to the Science of Hockey, the podcast where we break down the science behind ice hockey. I'm the analyst, your host, and every week we explore the data, research, and evidence that shape how we play, train, and understand the game of hockey. From biomechanics to performance psychology, we take you beyond the rink and into the research lab, giving you insights that go beyond hearsay and into what really makes the difference on the ice. Whether you're a player, a coach, a parent, or just someone passionate about the sport, we're here to bring you scientifically backed information in a language that's friendly and easy to understand. So grab your skates and let's dive into the science of hockey. Welcome to the Science of Hockey, where research meets the rink. I'm your host, the analyst. In this episode, we analyze foot and ankle injuries in collegiate hockey players, uncovering gender-specific trends and the impact of intense competition. Join us for a deep dive into the data shaping injury prevention.
All right, so ready to hit the ice. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into the world of hockey injuries. We're going way beyond the highlight reel, beyond those bone-crunching hits everyone thinks of, to explore something a little unexpected: foot and ankle injuries.
So right, and we're not talking about your typical rolled ankle here. We've got a study from the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program, and they tracked these injuries for a decade, a whole decade, from 2004 to 2014, and it gives us some pretty surprising insights.
Exactly. So we're talking NCAA hockey. We've got a decade of data, and we are totally focused on those, honestly, often overlooked foot and ankle injuries. And, I thought going into this, I had a pretty good idea of what we'd find. You see those, those big hits, guys going down, and you just kind of assume it's all about knees and shoulders, right?
Yeah, you're not alone there. I think we tend to focus on those more dramatic injuries. But what's so interesting about this study is it shows just how common and also how different foot and ankle injuries are in hockey. And that leads us to one of the first surprises here, a big difference in injury rates between men's and women's hockey. Men actually had 4 times higher a rate of foot and ankle injuries than women. 4 times.
Wow. Okay. That is a big difference, I'll admit. My first thought was, well, yeah, okay, men's hockey allows checking. So, of course, obviously, they're going to have those bigger hits, right?
Yeah.
More forceful impacts. But here's the thing. The study also found that even in women's hockey, contact with another player caused over 13% of foot and ankle injuries.
Yeah. It really shows how, well, the rules definitely play a role. Hockey, just by its nature, it's a sport that involves a lot of contact. And that contact, whether it's, full on check or just accidental, bumping into each other, it can really impact players' feet and ankles.
And that brings us to, this was the biggest surprise, I think, for me. The most common injury. It wasn't what either of us expected going in. I was all ready to talk about, high ankle sprains, the kind that you just wince when you see them. But sprains, they weren't even at the top of the list.
Nope, they weren't. For men and women, the most common injury was actually, well, it's much less dramatic, but it can be just as painful, I imagine. Foot or toe contusions. Just think about it for a second. Players flying around on these thin blades, sticks are swinging, pucks are flying, boards are all around the rink.
Right, yeah. It's like a recipe for bruised and battered feet, even with those skates.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the rigid skate boots, they do a good job of protecting the ankle. But the foot itself is really vulnerable. So it's like wearing armor on your shins but leaving your feet exposed.
That makes you wonder if there could be some innovation in skate design to give better foot protection, without sacrificing how well they perform.
That's a great point. And this is where understanding the details of these injuries is so important. It's not just knowing that, okay, contusions are common. It's understanding why and what that might mean for equipment, for training, even for the rules of the game.
Right. So let's talk about sprains, because even though they weren't the most frequent injury overall, they were a big part of the injuries in the study. And this is where I thought the study got really interesting, because it breaks down the different kinds of sprains and how they affect players.
Right. We tend to kind of lump all ankle sprains together, but there's a really important difference between what are called low ankle sprains and high ankle sprains. And that difference affects not just how the injury happens, but also how bad it is and how long it takes to recover.
Okay, so let's start with those low ankle sprains I think most people are familiar with. That classic rolled ankle, you land wrong and you feel that sharp pain on the outside of your ankle.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Low ankle sprains usually involve damage to the ligaments on the outside of the ankle, the ones that stabilize the joint when you move sideways. So when a player cuts quickly,
Right.
or changes direction suddenly, or lands awkwardly, those ligaments can get stretched or even torn.
Yeah, and the study found that low ankle sprains were the most common type of sprain, especially in women's hockey, which makes sense if you think about all the agility and quick footwork in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, even though they're common, low ankle sprains they're usually considered less severe than high ankle sprains.
Okay, so speaking of high ankle sprains, what makes those different, and why are they considered more worrisome?
Well, with high ankle sprains, you're moving up the leg, so to speak. It's not about those outer ligaments. It's about the ligaments that are higher up, above the ankle joint. They connect the two bones of the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula, and they really keep things stable when you're doing those powerful skating strides.
So, instead of twisting, these sprains happen from an impact or twisting force on the leg.
Exactly. So imagine a player getting checked hard into the boards or getting tangled up with another player, and they're skating fast. Those forces can really stress the high ankle ligaments, and that can cause sprains that are often more severe and take much longer to heal.
And the study showed that, right? High ankle sprains, while they're less frequent, they cause the most time loss for both men and women.
Yeah, exactly. They can be incredibly debilitating. Players can be out for weeks or even months before they can get back to, to where they were before the injury.
So it's really important to know the difference between high and low ankle sprains. It's not just, the words. It's about recognizing that. They happen differently. They can be different levels of severity, and that affects how you treat them and how you recover. So it's really interesting how a term like ankle sprain can actually mean a bunch of different injuries with very different effects on athletes.
Right. And that brings us to another interesting point from the study, the difference in injuries between practices and games. You might think that most injuries happen during those tough preseason practices when everyone's getting back into shape.
Yeah, I would have thought that. You'd think all that intense conditioning would lead to, more wear and tear. But that's not what the study found.
No, not at all. Actually, both men and women had more foot and ankle injuries during the regular season than in the preseason.
Wow. That's really surprising. So it's not just about conditioning and getting back in the swing of things. What else is going on there? Why are those regular season games riskier for foot and ankle injuries?
Well, it probably comes down to the intensity of the competition. During the regular season, the stakes are higher, players are pushing harder, and there's more physicality. Everyone's battling to win. All of those things create a higher risk environment for those foot and ankle injuries.
Right. So preseason is no walk in the park, definitely. But it's the regular season where things really get intense.
Yeah.
In terms of the competition. And unfortunately, the injury rate.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where understanding, those different ways injuries happen that we talked about before, it becomes even more important because by knowing how they happen, we can start to think about how to prevent them.
So let's look at those different ways they happen, starting with the most common one. Contact with what the study calls an apparatus.
An apparatus? That sounds kind of vague. What are we actually talking about there?
Yeah, it might sound kind of technical, but it basically means anything that's part of the rink. The boards, the goalposts, even another player's stick.
Ah, okay. So it's about those impacts with, hard surfaces and equipment that are just part of the game. Makes sense. And it really highlights that even with all the gear, there's some level of risk you just can't totally eliminate in hockey. Yeah, that's a really important point. And it's not always about the intentional contact either. Those accidental high sticks that sometimes catch a player's foot or ankle, those can be just as dangerous, especially when it's a fast-moving stick and a relatively exposed foot.
Right. Ouch. Yeah, I can only imagine. So contact with the rink itself is the most common culprit. What about player-to-player contact?
Well, that was the second most common mechanism for men.
Yeah.
Which isn't surprising given that checking is allowed in the men's game. Those collisions, even though they're meant to separate an opponent from the puck, they can definitely have some unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Including, those foot and ankle injuries.
Right, you've got players fighting for position, skates tangling, and those forces can be really significant. It's interesting, though. For women, the second most common mechanism, it wasn't actually player-to-player contact. It was what the study called acute non-contact.
Right, and that might seem a little strange at first. You think hockey, you think contact.
Yeah.
But even without that intentional body checking, Women's hockey it's far from a non-contact sport.
Yeah, it's still incredibly physical. You've got players battling for the puck, colliding while they're skating at high speed, and those collisions can definitely lead to injuries.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that those acute non-contact injuries can happen in all types of hockey. We're talking about sudden changes in direction, awkward landings, even collisions with the ice itself, and those things
Yeah.
can put enough stress on the foot and ankle to cause a sprain or even a fracture.
Right. It's like that saying, sometimes it's not the fall that hurts, it's the sudden stop at the bottom. And speaking of those sudden stops, let's go back to those contusions for a minute. You were saying earlier how the rigid skate boots, while they're great for performance, they can actually make those impact injuries worse. Yeah.
That's right. The boot, it gives you stability and helps transfer energy when you're skating, but it also creates a structure that can't really bend. So when a foot is trapped inside that boot and it gets hit by, a puck going really fast, that energy has nowhere to go except into the tissues of the foot.
It's like that physics demonstration with dropping a bowling ball on a rubber ball.
Yeah.
From the same height. The bowling ball, because it doesn't bend, transfers more of that impact energy to whatever it hits.
Exactly. And that's why contusions can be such a problem in hockey. They might not be as dramatic as a broken bone or a torn ligament.
Yeah.
But they can still cause a lot of pain, swelling, and even long-term damage if they're not managed well.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that all injuries, even the ones we might think are minor, they deserve attention and proper care.
Absolutely. And that leads us to a really important question. What can we do with this knowledge? We've talked about the types of injuries, the ways they happen, the differences between men's and women's hockey. So how do we take all that and turn it into action, into strategies that can actually help protect players and make hockey a safer sport?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? We can't just analyze the data and stop there. We got to take those insights and use them to make a difference on the ice. So where do we start? What are some concrete things we can do to reduce the risk of these foot and ankle injuries?
Yeah. A crucial first step is education. We got to make sure that players, coaches, parents, even medical professionals are really aware of the risks, especially the ones that affect the foot and ankle.
Right. Because awareness is the foundation for prevention, right? If you don't understand the risks, you're less likely to try to avoid them.
Exactly. And it's not just about knowing that ankle sprains happen. It's about understanding the different types, how they happen, and how bad even those seemingly minor contusions can be. Because when everyone is informed, they can start making better decisions about training, equipment, even how they play the game.
So education is step one. But what about specific strategies? Are there things we can do in training or changing equipment or even the rules of the game that could actually make a difference in the number of injuries?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot we can do. Let's start with training. There's a lot of evidence that strengthening programs that focus on ankle stability and something called proprioception can really reduce the risk of ankle sprains.
Proprioception, that sounds a little complicated. Can you explain that a bit?
Well, it's a pretty simple concept. Proprioception is basically your body's awareness of where it is in space.
Yeah.
Think of it like an internal GPS for your limbs. It lets you react quickly to changes in terrain or unexpected movements, and it plays a huge role in preventing those awkward twists and turns that can lead to ankle injuries.
So it's not just about building strength. It's about training your body to react better to those unexpected things that happen in hockey.
Yeah, exactly. And we can do that through, specific exercises that work on balance and coordination. We can also include drills that are like the movements of hockey to help players develop those quick reflexes and that sense of body awareness. That's so important for preventing injuries.
Makes sense. The more your body's ready for the demands of the game, the less likely it is to get hurt. Now, what about flexibility? Does that play a role in preventing foot and ankle injuries?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Making sure players have good ankle and foot flexibility is really important. A more flexible joint is less likely to be pushed too far, which can reduce the risk of both sprains and contusions.
It's like having a little more give in the system, allowing those joints to absorb impacts better.
Exactly. And we can work on flexibility through a combination of stretching exercises and mobility drills that target both the muscles and the connective tissues around the ankle and foot.
It's all about getting those joints ready for what they're going to have to do on the ice. And speaking of preparation, let's talk about equipment. We mentioned it earlier, but could we make changes to skates or protective gear to help reduce these foot and ankle injuries?
I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah.
We talked about how the stiffness of the skate boot, while it does provide stability, can also contribute to how bad those contusions are. Maybe there's a way to design boots that have a better balance of support and flexibility so you can perform well. But you also reduce the risk of those impact injuries.
Right, like finding that sweet spot between protection and mobility. You don't want to, sacrifice how well the skates perform, but you also don't want players' feet to be basically stuck in battering rams.
Exactly, and it might involve, using different materials, trying out new construction techniques, or even looking at how the boot fits with the foot and ankle to better distribute those impact forces.
Maybe there's room for improvement in other protective gear, too, like shin pads. They usually come down to protect the ankle, but they leave the foot itself pretty exposed.
Right.
Could we change their design to better protect the whole foot and ankle?
That's another thing we should look into. Could we design shin pads that offer more coverage without making them harder to move in? Or adding a lot of extra weight? Could we use materials that absorb impacts better, but are still light and breathable? These are all questions we should be asking as we try to find ways to protect players better.
It seems like there's a lot we could do when it comes to innovating with equipment. And it's exciting to think about how that could lead to, fewer injuries on the ice.
It is. Yep. And beyond equipment, we also have to think about the rules of the game. Body checking, it's a big part of men's hockey. But there's this ongoing debate about how it affects player safety. Could we have stricter rules or tougher penalties for dangerous checks? Would that help reduce those foot and ankle injuries, especially the ones that happen from player-to-player contact?
It's a tough issue with people on both sides feeling strongly about it. But if we want to protect players and make hockey a sport they can play for longer, then all options, including changing the rules, have to be considered.
Yeah, I agree. It's about finding that balance between keeping the traditions of the game and adapting to what we're learning about player safety.
And that makes me think about something else, the age of the players and how developed they are. This study was all about college athletes who are generally older and more physically mature, but how might injuries and ways to prevent them be different for younger players who are just starting out in hockey?
That's a great question. We know that younger athletes are still growing, both physically and in terms of their skills and coordination. So it makes sense that they might be more likely to get certain kinds of injuries, and that the ways we try to prevent them need to be, adapted to their needs.
Yeah, it's like anything with kids. You have to approach it differently. You have to recognize that they're more vulnerable in certain ways.
Exactly. So when we think about injury prevention in hockey, we can't just use a one-size-fits-all approach. We have to consider how old the players are, how much experience they have, how developed they are physically, and even the specific demands of, the league or level they're playing in.
It's about having a more specific approach to player safety. That takes into account all those factors.
Right, and that brings us back to how important education is. The more we understand about these injuries, the better we can prevent them, no matter how old the players are or what level they're playing at. And that's why studies like this are so valuable. They give us the data, the insights, and the basis for creating a safer and more enjoyable hockey experience for everyone.
It's about using that knowledge to help players, coaches, and parents make good decisions about how to train, how to play, and how to minimize the risks that come with this incredible sport.
Exactly. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. It's not just about understanding the problem. It's about looking at solutions and working together to make hockey a safer and more sustainable sport for generations to come.
Wow, it's amazing how much we learned from just one study. We started with those, those assumptions about hockey injuries, big hits, broken bones, and we ended up with a much better understanding of how common and how many different kinds of foot and ankle injuries there are, and how much they really affect players.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how research can challenge what we think we know and open up whole new ways of talking about things and coming up with new ideas. And it's not just about the findings themselves. It's about what we do with that knowledge, how we use it to make a real difference for athletes.
Exactly. And something you said earlier really stuck with me. You talked about hockey as a sustainable sport, and and that got me thinking about, the long-term health of players and how we can create an environment where they can enjoy the game without putting their well-being at risk.
Yeah, that's a really important part of this. It's not just about preventing injuries in the short term. It's about creating a culture of safety and awareness that helps players throughout their whole careers.
Yeah.
And even after they're done playing.
Yeah, and that's where this whole idea of, a more well-rounded approach to injury prevention becomes so important. It's not just about, taking ankles or wearing the right gear. It's about combining those things with a deeper understanding of, how the body moves, the principles of training, and what each individual player needs.
Absolutely. It's about moving away from that reactive way of thinking where we just treat injuries after they happen and moving towards a more proactive approach. That focuses on preventing them in the first place.
And that means changing how we think about those minor injuries, right? The contusions and those low-grade sprains. That might not keep a player out for long, but that can still, add up over time.
Exactly. We tend to focus on those really serious injuries, the ones that end a player's season, the ones that are all over the news. Yeah. But it's often those seemingly minor things that can lead to bigger problems later if they're not dealt with properly.
Right. It's like ignoring a little crack in a foundation. It might not seem like a big deal at first, but eventually it can weaken the whole structure.
That's a great analogy, and it really shows how important it is to intervene early, to do rehab the right way, and to focus on building up strength and resilience in those areas we sometimes forget about, like the feet and ankles.
Right, and it's not just about the physical stuff either, is it? There's also a mental side to injury prevention.
Oh yeah, definitely. Things like stress, fatigue, even just the pressure to perform well can all make you more likely to get injured.
It makes sense. If you're not, mentally focused and in tune with your body, you're more likely to, make mistakes or push yourself too hard.
Exactly. So part of, creating that safe and healthy environment for hockey is also about building a culture where players feel comfortable talking about their concerns, where they're encouraged to prioritize their well-being, and where they have access to resources that support their mental and emotional health, as well as their physical health.
Yeah. It's about creating a more holistic and supportive environment for athletes, recognizing that how they perform on the ice is tied to their overall well-being.
Exactly. And that takes us back to that final question that the study raised. How do these injury patterns and these prevention strategies apply to younger players?
Right. That's a big one. Because we know that kids aren't just small adults, right? Their bodies are still developing, their coordination is still getting better, and the things that put them at risk might be different than for older, more experienced athletes.
Right. And that's why it's so important for coaches, parents, even the young players themselves to be aware of these, age-related things. We need to be careful about how much we're having them train, what kind of equipment they're using, and the overall culture we're creating for these young athletes.
Right.
Are we putting their long-term development ahead of, short-term wins?
Yeah.
Are we teaching them the right techniques and how to prevent injuries right from the start?
Yeah. It's about setting them up for success, not just, in terms of how good they are at hockey, but also in terms of their long-term health and well-being.
Exactly. And I think that's, a really important message for everyone listening. Whether you're a player, a coach, a parent, or just a fan of the game, remember that we all have a part to play in making hockey a safer and more sustainable sport. It's about staying informed, asking questions, and speaking up for changes that could protect players at every level and make sure they can enjoy the game for years to come.
It's about moving beyond just, reacting to injuries after they happen and embracing a more proactive approach. That's all about prevention, education, and really respecting the well-being of everyone who plays this amazing sport.
Well said. And that's what I love about these deep dives. It's not just about, finding out information. It's about starting these conversations and encouraging people to think critically, which can lead to, positive changes and a better future for hockey.
Well, thanks for joining us on this exploration of hockey injuries. I hope you found it interesting. And as always, we encourage you to keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for those changes that can make a difference in sports and in life. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
Thanks for tuning in to The Science of Hockey. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to share it with your friends, teammates, or anyone who loves hockey as much as you do. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment to let us know what you liked, what you'd like to hear next, or any questions you have. Your feedback helps us make the show even better. Until next time, keep your skates sharp, your mind open, and keep chasing the science behind the game.